So, a caveman walked out of his cave early one morning, and his wife said, "Hey, how'd you sleep?" "Terrible," caveman said. "I was up all night trying to figure out where the sun went." And finally, it dawned on me. So this morning, those cavemen, you never know what they're going to say. So this morning we are going to talk a little bit about science and faith. Things have advanced so rapidly in our understanding of how nature works, in our understanding of medicine, in our understanding of physics, and on and on. I mean, it was only 500 years ago that people still believed that the planets and revolved around the earth, and that the sun revolved around the earth. 500 years ago, most people still believed the earth was flat. And in fact, unfortunately, there are people today who still believe the earth is flat. I have had conversation with two of them, and it wasn't pretty, honestly. And I think part of the reason that they hold on to those beliefs, or they claim them, is because things are progressing so quickly. I mean, and the rate of change or understanding is increasing at an increasing rate. It's going up like this. That's the curve. I mean, in the last 100 years, think of all the new knowledge in science and technology. And there are so many people, maybe most people, that think an understanding of science, or that science itself and physics and technology, stand in opposition to a belief in God. But I can tell you personally, in my life, science and a belief in God coexist harmoniously. There is nothing that they are in conflict about. Because when you think about what the purpose of religion is, to bring us closer to God. And the purpose of faith is to experience God. There was a 2nd century church father named Irenaeus who has this famous quote that I often use: "The glory of God is a human life fully lived." So, what is religion? Religion is, how can I live my life with the most compassion, with the most meaning, with the most joy, with the most truth, with the most peace. And that is never in conflict with science that I can see. And in fact, they work together well. It was Christians that planted hospitals all over the United States. That's a melding of science and religion. On the other hand, it was also Christians who, especially in the 80s, and I knew some personal friends who did this, who protested against the development and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And their protest wasn't that, boy, the physics is bad, or the physics doesn't make sense. No. What was their protest? Their protest was, these weapons have the ability to destroy life as we know it, to take away compassion and peace and harmony. That's another example in the opposite way of religion working with science and trying to help it be better. So there really isn't a conflict. The conflict comes only when we get into literalism and stay stuck there. For instance, if we're going to claim that we can go into Scripture and look at these genealogies and average the years between each generation and come out with the fact that the earth is only 6,000 years old, that doesn't work. If we literalize a story of a man living in a fish's belly for 3 days, that doesn't work. That's an obvious metaphor. And so if we can get past that, we're on our way. But then there's a second thing that I think sometimes stands in our way, and that is how we conceptualize God. We all kind of have one way of conceptualizing God, which is good, and I'm going to talk about that, but I think we need a second way as well. Let's talk about the first way. The first way is to see God as a being. In other words, to personify God. God is a being like us, with attributes, physical attributes like us in our mind, at least as we conceptualize God. And he has emotional attributes like us. He loves, right? He feels sad. And he can get angry and rage. And notice, throughout that whole description, I used a male pronoun, he, because that's what I grew up with. I grew up with personifying God as a man. And I still use it, and I still think in those ways. I grew up thinking that God was a man who was basically and mostly love. But, if occasionally you crossed him, he could get angry with you, but he would still love you. Unless you kept crossing him too many times and never stopped crossing him, then you would be sent to hell where he would be angry with you forever. I have jettisoned that piece of my personification of God. It's no longer a part of my understanding or view. I think it compromises the faith to keep it. But that's a topic of another sermon. So I do still personify God, but I also understand it as metaphor. I see God as a man that loves, and that loves me greatly. And it's only because I can personify God that I can reach out and love him back. You need to be able to do that. On the other hand, I also know that we need to be able to reach out to God when we're in a time of trial or a time of pain, like now. We need to know that we can reach out and hold God to get through it. So, seeing God as being is important. I have a friend who I grew up with, and he left the faith at an early age, mostly because it didn't match up with the scientific world we were growing up in and learning about more and more every day. And as he began to learn more, faith made less and less sense. And so when he moved away, he was living and working in San Francisco. And in 1989, I was watching the All-Star game, baseball All-Star game, and the whole stadium started rocking and shaking. And a bad earthquake was happening right at that moment. And they said, if you know anybody in San Francisco, don't even try to call. This was pre-cell phones. The lines are all jammed. You won't get through. Well, I tried anyway, about an hour later. And sure enough, I got a hold of my friend. I said, how are you? He says, I've never been this shaken up in my life, literally. He said, I was on the 7th floor of a building when the shaking started. And the whole building shook so hard and began to sway so much, I thought it was going to crumble with me in it. And that would be my end. And I said, what did you do? He said, me and a co-worker stood under a doorwell and recited the Lord's Prayer together. You see, at that moment, somewhere deep within him, he needed to know that he had a father that loved him, that wanted to protect him, that was going to listen to his cry and bring him in. That's a beautiful use of being. God is a being. We can't ever lose that. But the next day and for many days after that, he's back in the world. And if that is his only understanding of God, it doesn't match up with much that he knows and learns as to how this world, the natural world, functions and operates and how the universe operates. There needs to be a second way of understanding God. And that second way is represented in this reading that we did today. Paul says, the one God in whom we live and move and have our being. He's saying, basically, that we are all in God, and everything is in God, and God is in everything. So why don't we begin to see God that way? Actually, this is a more ancient way of understanding and seeing God. Before God was even conceptualized by people as a being, God was seen in the mountain, in a tree, in the animal that was just killed so that you could survive, in the fish, in the water. Our ancient ancestors saw God in everything. And it's interesting to me how that ancient understanding matches up so well with what we've learned today about our universe and how it works. And, don't let the church at some point putting a label on this understanding of God as pantheism and saying it's a heresy. Forget that. Throw that out. Try to see God in everything. Because this ancient understanding matches up so well with what we're learning today. If you get a chance, on the next clear night, go out and look up at the millions of stars in the sky. And know that probably around most of those stars there are planets revolving. Millions of galaxies, billions of them. And if you start to feel small, think about this. The atoms that form those stars, the atoms that form those planets that revolve around the star, are the same atoms that formed you. The exact same atoms. The atoms that are the building block of the universe are in the stars, but they also made you. The atoms that built those planets that revolve around the stars also built you. And so, as you look at the stars, you realize you are in the universe, but the universe is also in you. In the one in whom we live and move and have our being. God is a part of all of it. God is in it all. And so may you see each day God in everything around you. The more you see God, the more your life will become filled with compassion. The more walls will drop down. And you'll begin to see your great connection to all. And that's where you're going to find your peace. And that's a deep peace that you'll never lose. Amen.